That's it. It got folded in my software. Which is really sad, because it's
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Brinton Likes and happy to welcome you here on behalf of the Center for Human Rights and International Justice. And Canstrom and Tim Cars and our absolutely wonderful undergraduate intern who has helped put this together. And congratulations to all of you for weathering the weather and the ice, but particularly to Professor Kwon for re-encountering why he left New England, among other reasons. We thought we would give him the firsthand experience. So we're delighted to welcome Professor David Kwon, who is an assistant professor of theology and religious studies at Seattle University, a Jesuit counterpart on the other side of this country. He received his PhD here in morals theology, but he also holds an MBA from Johns Hopkins University and degrees in social work and social policy, as well as an MDiv from the University of Chicago. And he draws on his education and professional experience in these fields in his work as a social ethicist and something I've never heard of before, a theologian of intersectionality, which I'm delighted to learn more about. His teaching and research includes the ethics of peace, business and environmental ethics, healthcare ethics, and more recently, gender and racial justice, all of which he approaches from a global perspective. And we're delighted that he will speak to us based on his first book, Justice After War, that was published by Catholic University of America Press. And if you would like to purchase a copy, you can do so outside, and I'm sure he would be happy to sign it for you. He's also published several additional writings on the topics of the intersections between race, gender, and sexual violence and social class. Before joining Seattle, he was an assistant professor of theology and philosophy at St. Mary's University of Minnesota. And we are delighted that he has joined us today, and also that Professor Stephen Pope, who is here at the Theological Ethics Program in our department in the Morrissey School College, excuse me, who will give a response to the book, and there will be plenty of time for you to ask your own questions. So thank you, David, for joining us today.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Timothy Cart and Britton Likes and Daniel Canstrom. And also thank you for everyone for taking your precious time to be here with me. And as a man who was once involved in both military and peace building campaign, as a theologian, I humbly appreciate God's kindness in giving me the opportunity to learn and conduct research and write this book. This book is in many ways drawn from my dissertation work. So here I would like to express my sincere gratitude to my advisors and readers, Father Kenneth Hine, now at Siena College, and Professor Lisa Cahill and Professor Stephen Pope, who will also give his response to my book, my humble book. Fortunately, as you all know, like a first book is not only your book, it's more about like everyone's actually that you encounter in your graduate program, and you work with them together. So I really do appreciate my old professors and not only my dissertation committee, but also everyone here, Britton Likes and then Canstrom and Human Rights Program, but also many of my graduate school, former graduate school fellows, Tim Cart and Joshua Snyder. And I really appreciate your help, and we work this book together, I believe. And also my Seattle University students now watching these things, and we'll watch this recorded video later on. And I also appreciate their time to listen to this lecture together. Thank you. And the category of Jus Post Bellum, and Jus Post Bellum means post-war justice and peace, is a welcome addition to discussion of the justice of war. And the goal of this book is to review the significance of this recent development within the just war tradition. This project is based on a proposition that just war should aim at just peace. Peace does not mean the absence of armed conflict, but it requires the establishment of justice. So we call this as positive peace. And there is no true peace if it exists for the strong, but not for the weak, for the victor, but not for the vanquished. At the heart of Jus Post Bellum is the establishment of just peace. With this preliminary proposition in mind, this book endeavors to challenge the view of those who argue that reconciliation, mainly political reconciliation, is the first and foremost ambition of Jus Post Bellum. Instead, he attempts to justify the contention that achieving just policing, just punishment, and just political participation are key to building a just peace, of which the fundamental characteristic, I believe, must be human security. And in the immediate aftermath of war, there is little and no policing, punishment, and avenues for political participation to protect the civilians of defeated states, especially the most vulnerable ones. Therefore, this book argued first that human security is a neglected theme in the discourse of moral and theological intellectual tradition, and second, that a more balanced understanding of Jus Post Bellum must pay direct attention to the elements comprising human security in post-war context, as well as the quest for reconciliation together. Now, I probably want to talk a little bit. I'm standing here. Don't know the camera captures me now, but okay. So this is oops. So this is my like roadmap for this presentation, and following the presentation into this human rights seminar. So for now, this session, let's talk about Jus Post Bellum. What is Jus Post Bellum together? And I'll talk a little bit about my book, and I go over each chapter together. And then I will have like Q&A session after we hearing from Steve Pope, Professor Steve Pope's response to my work. Okay. All right. Okay. Jus Post Bellum and post-justice or peace building, the core is a set of principles to guide those making transition from war to peace. There are other categories or other principles called Jus ad bellum, or Jus in bello is just for tradition. Jus ad bellum, justice before war, why we need to wage war, and Jus in bello, how we actually fight. We should not kill the civilians. There are many principles about that too. Jus Post Bellum is a new emerging kind of the category into the just war tradition. But here the concept is, main idea is the aftermath of war is crucial, the justice of war itself. So, but I will tell a little bit later, though I have my own view about just war tradition too. And but I just want to share about the like basic concepts of Jus Post Bellum for now. And all right. Yeah, no Jus Post Bellum, no justice and no peace. Violence continues. And as many of you are already familiar with, and also reflecting on the current war in Ukraine and Russia, and Gaza and Palestine and that area too, and West Bank, and many other nations in the world, a lot of violence, a lot of war is happening, and we see a lot of news. People got killed, civilians got killed, or some people got raped, and these things happening again and again, throughout human history. And during the World War II, yes, we know that there are lots of war rapes, and in many nations invaded by Germany, Japan, and so have you heard about comfort women? No, some of them, yes. Right. They are used as like sort of with sexual slavery, to fulfill the soldiers or militaries their satisfaction. Well, but people's score these things also like happen, not only just to fulfill some people's desire, but also it's about use as a tactics of war. So in a way to foster fear against your enemy and the society. Right here, okay, should be careful with this. Okay, okay. Here there are also the books, but there are other literatures about like a case of post-war crimes and the happening the time during the occupation in Japan and during the occupation in Germany. And for example, like just one little island, Okinawa, 10,000 women they got raped. That's the like reported case, but there must have more cases. And then in only one city in Vietnam, more like 100,000 of people, women got raped too. So, okay, so but the case is a little different than the war rape. These two cases many times also happen, not only just to fulfill occupation armies, each others, but also some kinds of idea or some kinds of like project on revenge. So that happens again and again, and then so this is cycle of like violence. So how actually we stop these things together? So that's kind of thing they always talk with me when I talk about Jus Post Bellum together. Okay. Right, but this is what's happening too. Okay, and even among army people, militaries, and over 4 times as many as them die in combat. So what I mean here, what I want to say here is 30,000 suicide cases happened after the war, and compared to that, only 7,000, not just only, but 7,000 army people actually died. I think this is kind of surprising. Right? 30,000 people actually commit suicide. So these are another thing that we need to think about. What is like post-war justice? What is the way that we can involve in like dealing with post-war society, whether it's civilian or military. Okay. And of course, there are a lot of human rights issues. What about the soldiers or veterans' right to life and health, well-being? The one important thing is that we should not try to demonize people, whether they are soldiers or whether they are aggressors. No simple good or evil kinds of rhetoric that can found a lot, and then they kind of cause a lot of PTSD and moral injuries. So PTSD is based on about the people's fear, and moral injuries based on guilty, shame. We probably have more time to talk about these things during the Q&A. Okay, so ethical dilemmas of post-bellum and social prejudice. This is according to all human history. And then after the war, and when some people okay. So everyone is okay with me, right? Follow with me, right? Okay, all right. Social prejudice. Like we got some kinds of the like social prejudice that like toward people who fight for the war against war, also who got caught as a like slave and a special sexual slave. And then when they return to their own home, and people in their home country also judge them in many ways. And so that's social prejudice, and the laws definitely, and the political manipulation. Yes, political manipulation is controversial issues on the U.S. occupation on Iraq, right? And legally, politically, culturally, yes. And winners and losers, and another thing I put here like PTSD and mental health. There are many ethical dilemmas we need to deal together. Okay, and there is also dilemmas in practice. hard to have social justice in a context of endless wars and genocide. Thus, just war tradition or just war theory answer to post-war justice issues in practice? I would say no, and many people say no too. It's not perfect, it's just theory. Right here, on April 22nd, 2010, the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown conference examining three questions here. For 21st century application of Jus theory to wars and the Jus Post Bellum in three key areas. One, the theoretical underpinnings of Jus Post Bellum. Two, issues for settlement and post-war arrangement. And three, operational consideration for practitioners engaged in post-conflict planning. And at this conference, and the many also Jus Post Bellum thinkers and theories. And they also struggle with the third one particularly. So let's just watch quickly. This is just 2 minute video. And this is just 2 minute video, and then this kind of concluding remark.
Just hopefully touch on several questions. With the issues we have concerning the difference between endemic violence and war, where the boundaries are very, very difficult to ascertain. That concern, the concern we have about irregular war and all the excellent comments that Professor Lucas made about the fuzziness, the ambiguities of irregular warfare. I think some of the international lawyers may have hit on something. At least I think they're kind of ahead of us on this, ahead of the ethicists on this. And those who looked at the question of revising the law of occupation, of occupation after warfare, have in several notable cases suggested that what needs to happen is a merging, a combining of this traditional law of occupation with human rights law. And that we may in fact find some of our answers to some of these questions in international human rights law. I don't quite know exactly where that comes out, but it seems promising to me actually to say that there are some of these situations where we don't know if it's war or if it is some kind of lower level sub-state violence, where if the rules of war, if just war theory doesn't provide the answers, it may well simply be that human rights law does. And that I think may apply to a number of these situations. It may also help us with the question of justice after war in the case of an unjust war. Maybe we can't sort out all of the ethical issues, but maybe we can say, here is a point at which we say simply, human rights law applies. And that seems to me these are the good ways.
Great, well, on that very helpful note.
All right, guys. The reason why I actually showed this video clips is I just want to show that many Jus Post Bellum thinkers, there was a struggle with this question. And another reason is that I just want to say that my motivation about my intention behind this book, writing this book. And that kind of conference happened 2010. And after watching this kind of the lecture, I realized that, oh, yes, Jus theory is very much, it has a lot of problems. And Jus Post Bellum is the one that we need to work on together. But not many people actually engaging in beyond their own theory to expand their theory, like Jus theory, to work with other theory and practice together. And they see here, Robert Williams from Pepperdine University, he also mentioned, oh, yeah, Jus theory cannot really talk everything, but that's why some human rights law, humanitarian laws, well, maybe some social psychology, well, like other political system, and that they actually work together and to deal with this case together because this is a very complicated case. So based on this, I wrote this book, and not only about talking about theory, which on sake, but try to engage with other practice, like international law, just like he actually mentioned here, and also security studies, and what is a peace, peace building and peacekeeping, more like armed means they're using, but also nation building, non-armed means or non-violent means they're used together. And then also political participation, I call like not only state actors, but also what about non-state actors, like church or civil society organization, how actually they work together aftermath of war to rebuild the society and to make everyone safe. So this is kind of my kind of the direction to my book, I can say, and I'm very happy to talk about my book more today. All right, okay. Just want to say a little more. Little more here about because my own understanding of Jus Post too, and so based on this, people, also including myself, what sort of their struggles with like using theory or Jus Post theory into practice. And question is now, what sort of principle would you add and change or deliver successful Jus Post Bellum society? So for me, one thing I want to just make clear is that presumption against war lies at the Catholic thinking on war and peace. And starting with Pope John 23rd and continuing through the following modern practice of popes and a lot of popes, including Pope Francis, and we will see the like, of course, earlier Jus Post theories put more emphasis on what we call the presumption to justice, a presumption against injustice. That means war was understood as being morally acceptable as a means to establish justice. But now the presumption against war as a means to justice is changed. But the question still remains how to protect civilians in the war and post-war when war breaks out. Rather than just simply, we are against war, war is evil. But the reality now, as you see, war is happening. Then how actually we end war justly? How actually we protect civilians? That's still a good question for everyone. Of course, discipline, they actually need to work together. And for me, my own answer for this question is try to avoid all kinds of elusive, kinds of fuzzy ideas. They're all these kinds of Berkeley Center professor, they actually also share and try to as much try to avoid these kinds of concepts. Like there are many different ideas, concepts people talk differently, across discipline when they talk about Jus Post Bellum. So try to my first task for this book is try to make us find some common ground. And so from law literature, international law literature, security study literature, and Catholic social teaching or other social teaching literature. And so I make them down to the two common ground, which are popularly used in many scholars and practitioners. One is human security, another one is political reconciliation. After that, I reframe philosophical foundation. It's just what traditional theory. So one of the famous men, Michael Walcher, he actually made this theory very popular. But I think on the other hand, he also made this theory unpopular in a way. Because his idea of just war theory, I believe, is a very limited, and it does not really embrace what the Catholic or other religious tradition of war and peace stories. And so I reframe what the philosophical foundation and then develop a moral theology from that framework. Then after that, I also develop different kinds of practice. I call again just punishment and just policing and just participation, just political participation. So try to embrace various theories and practice together. So this is kind of my first book on Jus Post Bellum, but I know that there are a lot of challenges, there are a lot of limits, I already admit. So I need to develop more and more. And I think this is work for all the scholarship and we need to work together. So I will end for now. And okay. I'll see. Okay.
Okay, thank you, David, for this presentation summary of your work. It's really hard to take such a long and extensive project, and put it into a few points on the slides. I want to start by praising you, and then I want to ask a few questions. And I was on the dissertation that the book is based on, but you've done a lot more work from the dissertation. And I'm really impressed with what you've done in general. I learned a lot from the book. So number one, I really admire the clarity of the book and showing how these different disciplines can feed into a perspective that's in theological ethics, but not in a way that's isolated from other disciplines that are dealing with issues relevant to the question you're raising. So I think the clarity and the interdisciplinary nature of the book makes it very instructive. And in fact, I'm really impressed that you could handle so many sources with apparent competence. I'm not an expert in international law, human rights law, security studies, moral philosophy, social psychology. You deal with a lot, and you do it very clearly, and I think very admirably, as far as I can tell. The third thing I want to say is that I admire the fact that, unlike some strains of Christian ethics today, you don't just take a prophetic stand and bash everything. You don't just attack it. But in fact, this is a very constructive project. You identify a problem, you identify weaknesses and propose solutions, and then you advance your own position based upon just policing, just participation, and just punishment. The last three chapters of the book, I think, are real gems, and they can stand on their own even. I mean, you need the elaborate context to make a sense of the full impact of your proposal. But I've never seen those put together in such a tight way and a clear way as a way of talking about Jus Post Bellum. So the next thing I want to say that I admire about your work is that you seem to be, of the authors I know that you've talked about, you're very fair-minded. You don't take cheap shots. You don't have straw persons that you just knock down effortlessly. You don't look you don't treat your interlocutors as if they're stupid and you're smart. You are very respectful of their arguments, even when you don't disagree. And in fact, I'd say especially when you don't disagree, you bend over backwards to give them the most charitable interpretation, and then show why you think the shortcomings of their positions need to be surmounted, transcended in a high kind of argument that you give. But I think that's an admirable intellectual skill that you have, that I think it would be nice if more people in my field, our field, also practiced. I think the next point I want to say is that as someone who appreciates Thomas Aquinas, I really admire your ability to draw distinctions. Aquinas has a famous axiom that says, distinguish in order to unite. And a lot of people turn those distinctions into separations and dichotomies. Whereas what you want to say is, no, they're related, but they have to be related in an intelligent and helpful way, in a practical way. For example, national security and human security. national security has to be part of human security, but it's not sufficient for the task of peace after a just peace, after a just war. The way you draw distinctions between ad bellum and in bello norms, showing their continuity, but also what's distinctive about the in bello norms is also really helpful. And then, of course, relating those to the post bellum kind of criteria that you have. So here are my questions. And I don't expect you're going to have to answer everything off the top of your head, but I just kind of want to put it for your consideration, and maybe you can make some comments, but I think they're worthwhile thinking about over a long term. So the first question I have is, when you I think you somewhat sharply distinguish Jus Post Bellum from transitional justice.
Yes.
And I wonder if that distinction can be made quite so sharply. It seems to me like it's more of a continuity, more of a process that's developmental, but you have to hit some things are more essential than others, but they're still part of the project. So I wonder about the first question is, what's the relationship between Jus Post Bellum and transitional justice? The second question is related to that, which is your treatment of political reconciliation, which I very much appreciate. I think could be developed even further by distinguishing varieties of political reconciliation. You do some of that, but I think you could do more. John DeGruchy distinguishes between weak and strong political reconciliation, more of a spectrum than two types. And then distinguishing political reconciliation, but also relating it to social reconciliation. Social reconciliation, at a minimum, I take it, is the ability of people who are once enemies to function together in the same political space, recognizing their rights to participate. Social reconciliation seems to me is much more a sense of cooperation, mutual trust, some degrees of trust. And the end of that is probably the strongest version of political reconciliation is solidarity. So how do you connect political reconciliation with the postbellum transitional justice transition or continuity there? Last question, third question is, you wisely defend the notion of imperfect justice because you recognize the messiness of real life political situations and the complexities of societies coming out of conflict. To what extent is a successful execution of post-bellum values, norms, the three you mentioned, to what extent is the failure to fulfill those due to the failure of the just war itself? And this is essentially a question about to what extent can those act kind of retroactively to cast a negative judgment on the entrance into war and then the conduct of war as it's going on. I think in your book, you make a really interesting point that when entering into war, you also have to think about what's the end, right? And that's part of just cause and right intention. You want to seek peace, and you intend to do that by using just means.
Mm-hmm.
Is the failure to properly plan for use post-bellum in the ad bellum stage a legitimate criticism, or is it in a sense putting the cart before the horse? Given the dynamic nature of war, how much things change? Is it helpful to think that before entering into the war, you have to have a plan post-bellum, given the way in which things can change so radically? And I'm not saying it is unfair, but I want to know what you think about that. That makes sense?
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
Yeah, all right. Oh, thanks so much. simple. And you always give me a like really enlightening question and a very sort of question too, like through my dissertation writing process, and also even now. And
I
if
won't
not-
go away.
He also provides a lot of resources for me as well. Very good. And here, though, like the question about the difference between Jus Post Bellum, what I call post-war justice, and transitional justice. And there are many ways we can also say about these things, how actually they're different. But one way I can clearly say is that transitional justice is more about, I believe this is more like change the regime.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
The democratic.
the democratic regime from totalitarian regime or other sort of regimes. And so here, because there is some idea when they talk about transitional justice in some of the peace scholars, peace study scholars, when they address this issue, it's like they believe that democracy also build peace
Mhm.
and promote peace. There are a lot of democratic peace theory. Dynamic theory, systemic theory, and so like one democratic nation should not, they are not fighting against another democratic nation. But do we see the like democratic nation, they fight against non-democratic nation, still do. And so basically that idea like transitional justice, like wanna really transition into democratic regime and to make everyone feel safe and no more conflict. And but I would say the like if I really, this is also back to your second question too. And if we really want to still with this like transitional justice and post-war justice together, I think the important thing, I think you tackle a little bit here too. But it's not just a question about justice, but it's also about peace and how actually we build peace together. And here, like a complex kinds of literature, nature of these kinds of entire nature of Jus Post Bellum, also transitional justice nature, transitional justice literature is, I think this everyone define peace differently. So some, yeah, so even theologian, like we have a lot of terms like eirene or shalom or pax. They all have different kinds of meaning of peace. And peace is more about like building order, like safe order, just order. Another one is about your eschatological interior peace, or full peace. But here I would say that like in order to deal with this kinds of transitional justice or post-war justice, I want to like make really clear boundary that transitional justice is more like long term, or like long term kinds of way of building peace together, making society more peaceful, not necessarily to be democratic, but making peaceful. And in that way, yes, we can not only talk about political peace, but also can talk about interior peace, or even for Christians or Jews, and covenantal peace or eschatological peace together. So different kinds of peace, and we can also apply together, and from a theological, also ethical perspective. But the post-war justice that I focus on this book is more into based on like short-term framework based on the policy making process, all this making decision process, and within the just war frame, framework. So there is a difference, of course. And also you mentioned about social reconciliation. That's the things I'm really excited to learn more about it. And I not only that I'm passionate about to learn more about it. And actually the chapter 7 of my book, so this is kind of the presentation that I need to promote my book, but I kind of tackle my book at the same time. And because I'm learning more and more in the chapter 7, and that book I actually rewrote entirely, and from just work framework to just peace framework. And that's also the one of the question, answer to your question that just political participation, that's kind of the most difficult part. Actually, we build together.
It doesn't just mean voting, right?
Yes, it's not just mean voting, it's not just mean gaining political power, and it's not just like top-down, like making decision. It's everyone, every stakeholders in the society, they have to involve together, and the different kinds of human rights issues they have to also address together. And social reconciliation takes like really a more longer time. It's most of forgiveness and reconciliation. And we also talk about like political reconciliation. There are transitional justice, the weak and strong kind. So there are many ways we can also discuss together. And we have to develop more theory into practice. In my new chapter, revised chapter of mine, chapter 7, which is published in Journal of Catholic Social Thought. And I more focus on like nonviolent means. And also engage in how actually faith-based organization or other civil organization, so civil social organization, they work together to meet not just about Catholic social teaching, but also Christian teaching, but also like to meet with like such as like universal kinds of good movement in our political and social arena, such as UNDPs, their kinds of World Banks, human rights plan, how actually we engage together in the post-war society. So I try to meet together and make them common ground together, but it takes time. It takes time to really apply these kinds of comprehensive version of post-war justice into post-war context. Yes, and but personally, I also realized the important thing is that when I work on this chapter, I realized that oftentimes we only focus on who is going to be punished in the post-war society and who are the people who need to be protected. And oftentimes we leave out people. We usually make them like some like soldiers from the aggressors or government officers from the enemy nation, and we often make them demonized. But here is a question about human rights and how actually we embrace everyone's human rights in an appropriate and effective manner together. And everyone can make a mistake, I think. Everyone make.
He looks at me when he said that.
Yeah, I did too many times in my life too. Yeah, and so the question here is like to make these people to also invite our society together. I think that's a big task for social reconciliation and also that you mentioned about this here together. That means social. It's not just political parties or political groups. They work together to make peace, but it's a social. How actually we work together, how actually we forgive together, how we embrace together. Everyone's right, and again, everyone can make a mistake. So that's what I want to say. Yes.
Thank you. Well, now we have some time for your comments, questions, thoughts. Yeah.
Question as I'm finishing.
Why don't you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, so I'm Kieran Haller and I'm a student over at the CSTM, so I'm doing my MDiv and STL right now. So you talked about in your sort of proposals for sort of how we approach or how we adapt Jus Post Bellum, about it, sort of those common grounds of human security and political reconciliation. And I suppose when considering human security, I'm curious to hear how, I'm trying to think like how to frame this in a question. How broadly do you conceive of human security, or how human security might relate or interact with other values that we have? So I'm thinking particularly like questions of civil liberties, where I could imagine places, and certainly in some countries where they just simply don't value civil liberties
Mhm.
in the same way that we might in the United States or in other Western nations. And so how do you see that relationship between human security and civil liberties? Do you need one for the other? Can you have one without the other, or?
That's a good question. Should I listen to everyone's question together?
Would you like to
Yeah,
do
I
it
think
that way?
that would be
Okay.
better, yeah. Good question. Civil liberty.
Dan?
Yeah, I had a question. I guess it's for both of you, and it's just sort of a big picture question. You know, I've been teaching a class this year that includes both human rights law and the humanitarian law of war. And I've been thinking a lot about whether this concept of Bellum actually retains utility sort of in the post-industrial age, where there was a time when I think there was a brighter line between basic stability of a fiefdom or a principality or even state versus arming and going to war and using violence. But now we have so many forms of detention and oppression and violence that just continues over time without declarations of war. And the big debate in law has been about just what you were talking about. What is the line between the invocation of humanitarian law versus human rights law? And I guess would be interested in your thoughts about more about how we merge those two things, because the very definition of the post-bellum society becomes really problematic in situations where that has extended over very long periods of time, where there's an ongoing occupation, where war begins and then it ends and then it begins again, you know, continuing over time. So it makes me wonder about the project seems to assume a certain boundary that I'm not sure. I think it's becoming increasingly less true, you know, thinking about drones and surveillances and, you know, all the technological advances that we're seeing, where there's sort of violence and force being used on a much more regular basis all the time.
I'm gonna build on that question and ask, one of the things that, I recently, or some of us here, recently read an article by Antje Krogh, who is a South African who participated very actively in documenting the truth and reconciliation processes there. And she recently wrote an article about rethinking reconciliation and forgiveness in South Africa. And in terms of Dave's question about wars persisting over, or hard to find a boundary, I think this article raises really provocative questions about, it's hard to find a boundary about whatever reconciliation or whatever truth is. And part of what she's arguing is that the Black populations in South Africa were quite open to forgiving. And there was a negotiation around the perpetrators. But she argues that within their framework of African traditions of understanding what forgiveness means, they expected that that was going to be a piece of white people behaving in different ways in the post conflict situation there. And they didn't get that. And she argues that when they didn't get that, they got angry. And that we now are seeing a different set of responses to that process, because there were really two fundamentally different understandings from two very different traditions about what these terms might mean. So I'm just wondering, and I think that the discussion of transitional justice is a really important one, because in some ways, the way in which you deal with it in the book, it too is evolving and changing, and people talk about transformative justice, and there's justice from the ground up, and so there are a lot of different understandings of what we even mean by that term anymore, although there's definitely a predominant one. So how do we think about these? Are these border conditions and boundary conditions? Are we living in moments where that slide that you put in the beginning with all of the violence in the post-war periods persists, as Dan has suggested? So what does, I mean, all of this raises a very provocative question about what in the world we think peace.
Correct, yeah.
Because you do distinguish between positive and negative peace, and we
Right.
barely, I think, have negative peace in many of these examples.
Okay, and there
Another
are.
one, can you remember all four? of these?
You don't think that's enough?
Just gonna tick off the answers and you can relax.
Yes, okay. Do you wanna go first?
I'll go first because I'll be short. Um, I think you're right, Dan, that just war theory is not adequate to deal with governing or give moral guidelines for the use of lethal force. Most, as you know, I mean, most large-scale violence isn't state against state anymore. And it's not only insurrections, but it's also large-scale and very wealthy institutions like cartels. So I think, but I think instead of throwing out or saying the notion of Bellum is no longer useful, it seems to me it'd be better to keep what we have and expand it and try to refine it so that it is able to at least be used to address cases that distinguish the just and unjust use of lethal force against insurrection or against criminal organizations. How that's done is going to be David's job. But I think it really does need to be done. And Brenton, I'm not sure about what your question was.
It's just a comment about
Comment, okay.
how we think about what's the timeline on peacemaking? I mean, what do we? And you know, for me, it's also related, you didn't talk about this now, David, but your book talks a lot about the responsibility to protect and the importance of the responsibility to protect.
Mhm.
And that I think is linked to the ways in which you talk about reconciliation, of political reconciliation. And there's a lot of critique from as I'm sure you know, if you're an intersectional scholar, through critical scholarship, critical race theory, and decolonial scholarship, that your book doesn't deal with at all. But some of the ways in which you presented today provoke around, certainly around sexual violence against women, provokes the need to think from, so the edges of all of this also have to do with who determines what's a just war, who determines who has the right to intervene, and how do these get determined? And Stephen, you made it more complicated as far as I'm concerned in talking about the paramilitary forces and economic.
Well, I'll just say one thing. Then Dave.
Sure, yeah.
I think
Yeah.
South Africa is a case in which there was well-intentioned decisions to install an institution, the TRC, that would help facilitate social reconciliation. But the settlement there didn't deal with the economic injustice. And so if you follow, I think the generally accepted view that without justice, there's no peace, no justice, no peace. Simply addressing the political injustice wasn't sufficient for dealing with the social and economic injustice that pervaded South Africa, the apartheid regime, and it really wasn't changed by the political process.
Well, could you identify one of the contemporary wars where that has been addressed? I mean, there were efforts in the post-World War I, post-World War II experiences,
Right.
but look at Guatemala, look at El Salvador.
Right.
I mean, you can tick off. You can blame it all on transitional justice if you want, but transitional justice doesn't deal with those material issues either in any structural or systemic way, right?
In his account of human security, it seems to me would have to address this if developed more. Is that right, David?
Oh, sure, yes, yes.
So he's at least
Right,
acknowledging
yeah.
it as a key issue. But you're talking also about political will to promote those forms of justice, right?
Yeah, it's not just justice
No.
and security, though, it's equity and equality.
Right.
Also
Yes.
reparations and redistribution.
I think of that as part of justice, but not punishment, but broadly more distributive justice.
Okay, thank you for your response, Steve, and thank you for all of your question. I mean, go with this one, and after that, I will touch on your question too, of course. And The thing is for like a problem for Jus Post theory and Jus Post Bellum theory too, I believe. And many literature, I think, both of you actually mentioned here. And this theory is really more about like justice for security and making everyone safe and common good. But here the idea about the equity or equality, these things are missed out from all the just for tradition theory I see so far. And because they have different agenda. And this idea of equity, well, egalitarian culture that we live by in the United States, but many of the developed nations, which have different kinds of nuanced understanding of equity or right and justice and common good in other nations, including global south. That I want to mention first. And we have, like, for example, like what you mentioned, civil liberty, and then like freedom to everyone, the equal access, equity. Yeah, this kind of idea is now very popular, of course, and not only about like as a theology and of intersectionality thing, but it's very popular in many different kinds of disciplines these days. Even healthcare ethics, we talk about social determinants of health. And business ethics, we talk about not only about shareholder theory, but stakeholder theory. And because this is all based on equity, egalitarian culture. And there is a professor, sociologist, Terry Clark at University of Chicago. He mentioned, and that even in the late 20th century, he mentioned that we, especially United States, we live by, and many of the Western society we live by so-called egalitarian culture, and more into 21st century. And after that, that kinds of the theory idea is very popular in everyone, post-colonialist, colonialist, liberationist, and everyone is involved in this kinds of dialogue too, of course. And they want to mention about these things in their own literature when they deal with, including transitional justice and postal justice. And so I know they used a lot about the case of Guatemala, right? Guatemala. But here, the question for this is all these kinds of the egalitarian culture-based literature I call, including all these kinds of different branch. And the question of who is actually taking responsibility, who is actually in charge. This also goes to the Daniel stems from a question about the law, humanitarian law and human rights law. The question here is also about who is going to charge. And it's going to be ICC, or it's going to be United Nations Security Council, or it's going to be local community court, right? And that happened a lot in the transitional justice in South Africa, and local court, right? So who is actually in charge, how actually get involved? And it's a difficult process, just like one thinker and me, as I talk about how actually this work together. But there is a process, there has to be priority, especially in the post-war context. That is, everyone has to be safe, their life, the human right to life. So who is actually most vulnerable population? And we need to look at these things first, and we need to develop our law, and we need to apply these legal ideas into practice. And how actually we take care of them together toward working toward social reconciliation. I think that's the direction I can say from now. And as a theologian, I must believe that too. And civil liberty and human security, and there is a difference between, of course, national security and human security. And we don't really sacrifice human rights, right to address your ideas and thought, and to make because you're actually causing a lot of problems. So we have to really oppress your opinions, so your liberty. No, this is not the post-war justice. Say yes, and that's beyond. This question is more the beyond national security, which is based on your national border and boundary. It's more about human security. We focus on human rights and to many different rights. You know that like you're taking international human rights class. And the first things I learned when I was here, and with Father David Hollenberg, first class, we talk about there are a lot of human rights. And how actually we address them in a different way, and how actually we prioritize and who is actually doing these things, right? So I think that applies to also occupation law and also in transitional justice context.
Thank you so very much, both of you. This was a wonderful.
Interesting.
And a reminder, there are books outside if anybody wants to get one and have David sign it, or if you have one already, he's available for a few more minutes. Thank you very much. And thank you all online.
So